Okay, good morning, everybody. Shavua Tov. Welcome back. Thank you for coming. It's a time of turmoil, a time of Torah. So the time of tea comes tomorrow. But thank you all for coming. Wonderful to be together once again, learning from the Tzurba Marabanan series, Hilchot Shabbat. We're going to be experts in Hilchot Shabbat by the end of this. We've been working our way through the halachot of bishul, of cooking. We spent a number of weeks discussing the halachot of bishul, the oraita, on a Torah level, what constitutes the malacha of bishul. We then moved on a couple of weeks ago to the Isurim, or the Gzerot Rabbanan relating to bishul. We spent the last two shiurim discussing shehiyah in terms of leaving food on the fire before Shabbat comes in. To what extent does the food have to be cooked? To what extent does the fire have to be covered? What are the applications in modern appliances, etc.? That was shehiyah. Okay, we'll leave that. We're not going to go over that again today. However, a number of the halachot which we'll discuss today, a number of the conditions and things, or by nature of it, are common with the sugya we've just been discussing previously, as we've mentioned a number of times. Right? Rabbanan instituted three basic gzerot when it comes to cooking on Shabbat. And again, all of this is talking about, as I keep saying, and I'll say it again, but this discussion only begins when we know that we are not transgressing bishul the oraita. It's always our first question. If you imagine sort of like a flow chart, right? We want to know, is this activity allowed on Shabbat or not? So my first question is, am I cooking on a Torah level? I can only cook on a Torah level if the food is not cooked. Again, to what extent we've discussed. I can only cook on a Torah level if I am performing an action on Shabbat itself. So when it comes to shehiyah, which is before Shabbat, I'm clearly not transgressing the malacha of bishul. What we'll discuss today, chazara, is on Shabbat, so it gets a little bit more complicated. Okay, but that was question number one. Now, these Gzerot Rabbanan, with shehiyah, chazara, etc., there are two major concerns that Chazal have, and we'll discuss them a little bit more, why they instituted these. Concern number one, which we discussed at great length in the previous topic, was that a person may come to stoke the coals. You have your food that's on the fire, you're worried it's not going to be ready quick enough, you need to stoke the coals, make it a bit hotter in order to get it ready. That is one concern. A second concern which Chazal had was michzikim bashel. I may perform an act which is not cooking, but it looks like cooking. It appears that I'm cooking, and therefore, whether that's because again, whenever we have these kind of gzerot, and it's because it appears like something, the question is that a concern that other people are going to see and are going to suspect me? Or is it a concern that it looks like cooking, I feel like I'm cooking, I don't remember that I'm doing the difference, and I may come to end up cooking, whatever it is, but that is what we call, that is michzik im bashel, right? So those are going to be, so the process is always going to be like this, going back to our flowchart, imaginary flowchart in our head. Number one, am I doing something which constitutes a violation of bishul d'oraita? Only if the answer is no, can I move on to the next step. The next step will be, in the action that I'm doing, is there a concern that I might come to stoke the coals or raise the heat? If there is, then stop, I can't do it. But if there's not, then I go to the next step. And the next step will be, is the action that I'm about to do, does it appear to be cooking? Is it similar enough that it looks like cooking? Only if I've solved all three problems can I do what I need to do in order to heat up the food, in order to make the food hot, right? Chazal do want us to have hot food on Shabbat. We are not kara'im. We saw the source in the past, right, where the Rosh writes that, in fact, somebody who does not have the kara'im took it very, very literally, right? That you cannot light fire on Shabbat. So the kara'im understood, because they did not have the oral law, or they questioned the veracity of the oral law, and therefore they said it means that you cannot have fire in your house on Shabbat. So therefore, there are kara'im to this day who sit in the dark on Shabbat and who eat cold food. So the poskim write that somebody who eats cold food on Shabbat, we may have to suspect they might be a kara'i. So therefore, we make sure that we have cholent, to make sure that we have hot food. We have to do it in the permitted way. Somebody said to me last week, I said, the shiurim are so complicated. You're going to keep the food hot, heat up the food. There's a simple solution. Just have cold cuts and potato salad. So that's not so simple, because Chazal said we want to have part of Onik Shabbat is having the hot food. So let's try and understand how we can do it and how we can ensure that we have hot food on Shabbat. So now that we've done shehiyah, which was last week, we've kept our food hot before Shabbat came in. The question is now, for example, number of scenarios that come up when it comes to chazara. Let's say you have young children at home. So let's say they need to eat a little bit earlier, right? So Shabbat comes in, you have candle lighting time, you feed the kids chicken soup. Can't have Friday night dinner without chicken soup, right? So you want to feed the kids chicken soup, but then they go off to bed, and then you come back from shul and you have guests or whatever, and you eat your meal later. Okay, that's scenario number one. Scenario number 2 might be that you have the cholent cooking. You want to taste from the cholent on Friday night, or you want to have, after dinner, you have your Oneg Shabbat, you have a bit of cholent and kugel, whatever it is. But then you want to put the cholent back to keep cooking for the next day. Okay, so these are scenarios that come up. Our question is as follows. Once you've taken the food, we know that you can leave the food on the hot plate before Shabbat. We discussed that last week. Fine. But if you want to serve, as we've discussed in the past, you start stirring around in the pot or in the cholent, that's a problem while it's on the fire. So you would need to take it off the fire, right? So you take it off in order to serve. And now you want to put it back on. Are we allowed to do that? That is our question. That is the question of chazara. There is another question which comes up, which is the case of what's called hanacha lekatchila, not returning food to the fire, but placing food on the fire. Okay, so I wake up on Shabbat morning and I have my schnitzel, my kugel, or whatever in the fridge. It's fully cooked. I want to place that on the hot plate. So that is a separate question. We'll come to that afterwards. But first, we're going to discuss the question of achsara. So with that introduction, let's open up to page 167. Okay, and as ever, with these topics, you're going to need a little bit of patience today, so bear with me. First, we're going to go through the basics, the fundamentals, the principles as they appear in the Gemara and the Poskim, and after that, we will get to the practical applications, because as we know, the modern day ovens and stoves and electric hot plates are slightly different to what they were in the days of the Gemara. Okay, we'll have to see how that applies. So there are, so let's see, page 167, we begin in source number 1. Unusually, we start this week in source number 1. But the Rambam, in Hilchot Shabbat, the third parak, writes as follows. He says, Kol shemutar lishoto al gabei ha'esh, kshenotlim oto b'Shabbat, asur lachzir limkomo. Okay, that is our starting point. That is our basic, anything that you can leave on the fire on Shabbat, that is shahiyah, that we discussed last week and the week before. Now, on Shabbat, when you take it off the fire, our default is you may not put it back onto the fire. Okay, don't worry, the shir is not going to stop there. If the shir stopped there, so we have a problem, but we're going to continue. We will see what are the concerns why you cannot put it back on the fire. What are the number of conditions that are going to permit this chazara? So essentially 2 concerns, which I've already mentioned, which are going to prevent us from, if these conditions are not present, are going to prevent us from returning food to the heat source. Source number 2 on page 168, that is the Rashba. And the Rashba writes over here, he says, okay, again, we find these reasons that it comes up in different contexts in the Gemara, in the Rishonim, but he says we have a concept of something that looks like cooking. When I put food, when I take a big pot and I put it onto a fire, generally speaking, why do I place a pot onto a fire? In order to cook. On Shabbat, I'm not allowed to cook. So if I do it in such a way that is the ordinary way that you would place the pot for cooking, that looks like cooking, what we call michzikim bashel, and that would be a concern. So that is one reason why, under certain conditions, we say you cannot, once you take the pot off the fire, when you put it back on, if you left it on before Shabbat, so I'm not doing anything on Shabbat, I left it there from beforehand. But now I'm actively putting the pot on the fire, that looks like cooking. Okay, we will discuss, I don't know if we'll get there today, maybe next week, but we will discuss an electric hot plate, right, or platat Shabbat. So everybody knows that a hot plate of Shabbat, you don't cook on a hot plate. You warm your food up. It's even called a Shabbos hot plate, right? So that may change things, but we'll get to that. But the concern is michzikim bashel. The second concern, or the first concern, you see in source number 3, which is Sefer Yashar Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam was one of the Baalei Tosfot. Most of the things we know about Rabbeinu Tam come from Tosfot throughout the Gemara, but he also wrote a number of Svarim himself. One of them is called Sefer Yashar, and he writes, V'day shlachush l'shem ha'yichateh. As we've been discussing at length, the concern of stoking the coals. Ulefichach eino machzira ad shigrof o ad shiten et ha'efer kedamrinan behakila. Hakila is the name of the chapter in Masechet Shabbat, which we've been discussing. In practice, as you can see here, the halacha follows both explanations. So anytime we're going to look at the different conditions, these conditions are going to need to alleviate both of these concerns, both that you will not come to stoke the coals or raise the heat, and that it will not appear to be cooking. Now, in our books, we've got 5 conditions that are mentioned over here. Again, if you look through the different books, different contemporary Sfarim on Hilchot Shabbat, okay, everybody has a different way of classifying and a different way of counting how many conditions. Some say 3, some say 4, some say 5, but they're all the same conditions. The question is whether we list this as a condition or, it's reminiscent of, we know that there are 613 mitzvot, Tarag mitzvot. Everybody agrees on that. Right? There is a major disagreement between the Rishonim and the Achronim as to what is included in the 613 mitzvot. So the Rambam wrote his Sefer HaMitzvot, and then the Ramban wrote his commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvot, and he writes, well, this shouldn't be included. No, not necessarily that the argument is whether you should or shouldn't have to do something. There are many cases where the Rambam and the Ramban agree that something is we're obligated in performing it. But there's a question: should we count this as one of the 613? It's a question of classification. Sometimes there is an argument as to whether something is obligatory or not. But so the Ramban goes through and he writes in his commentary over here, the Rambam got it wrong. He shouldn't have included this. He shouldn't have included this. Well, if he shouldn't have included that, so he has an introduction where he says, and these are the mitzvot which he didn't include that he should have included, right? So you have the Rambam and the Ramban, and then you have the Sefer HaMitzvot, Sefer Mitzvot Katan, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, Sefer Chinuch, Sefer Yerayim, etc. An entire vast literature of how do we classify the 613 mitzvot. So it's not quite the same thing over here, but we have machlokot. Should this be considered a condition? Should this be considered a condition? Okay, but we're going through the 5 conditions. All of these need to be present in order for us to be able to, again, our question is, achzara. I have food at the onset of Shabbat or during Shabbat, the time of my meal. My pot is on the hot plate, heat source, fire, whatever it is. I now take it off. I remove it from the fire. Can I place it back on the fire? What needs to be, what needs to be done? So, condition number 1 is we are dealing with food which is fully cooked. If the food is not fully cooked, as we've discussed many times, we know that we have a problem because that is not an Isur D'Rabbanan, that is an Isur D'Oraita. Okay? And therefore, so some will not include this as a condition, just what I was saying in terms of classification, because this has got nothing to do with it. In D'Rabbanan, this is already, this is the introduction, this is, before this, there's nothing to talk about. But the food needs to be fully cooked, because again, if the food is not fully cooked, and that means, even if, the way we paskin, even if the food has reached Machal Ben Drosai, right, which is where it is somewhat, it's not fully cooked, but it could be edible, as we've discussed, half cooked or a third cooked. If I now place that food on the fire to make it fully cooked, that we consider to be cooking on Shabbat, so that would be forbidden. So source number 4, the Biur Halacha, he mentions, he says, on Shabbat you took the pot off the stove, right? And you're not sure if it's fully cooked or not. If you're not, even if you're not sure, he says you cannot place it back. Because you might be cooking, right? I guess you would say, why here there's a safek. This is a safek in a din d'oraita, because if it is not fully cooked, you are performing a biblical violation of the malacha of cooking, and therefore you cannot put it back. Okay, so that is condition number 1. That's what we're talking about. Now, I'll just mention, I don't think it's included here in the 5 conditions. Does the food have to be hot in order for us to put it back? So this we discussed previously. This is the discussion of bishul achar bishul. If we are dealing with a solid food, okay, so long as it's fully cooked, it doesn't need to be hot for us to put it back, even if it's cooled down, so long as all the other conditions are fulfilled, then we can put it back. If we're dealing with a liquid food, more often than not, that's the case, chicken soup or whatever it is. So if it has cooled down, then it's considered, as we've learned, that for a liquid, we consider that there is bishul achar bishul. In other words, if it's cooled down and I put it back on, that would be considered cooking again. So there it needs to be hot. But we haven't listed that as a separate condition because that falls under the category of fully cooked. A liquid that is no longer yad soledet bo, we consider that it's not, that is no longer fully cooked. Yad soledet or still a little bit hot, but as we've discussed. Yeah.
Is churn a liquid or solid?
Is churn a liquid or a solid? So that's a very good question. Probably we would assume in most cases that churn would be a liquid. Yeah. Rav Moshe Feinstein, we've seen this before, but Rav Moshe Feinstein has a definition. He's asked a question about ketchup, and the definition he gives is how do you know if something is solid or a liquid? He says if you leave it on the plate and if it retains its shape, then it's solid. But if it if it falls down and it's then it's a liquid. That says other poskim give different definitions, but that is that. Obviously, and it depends. It may depend on the texture. Sometimes you have a churn which is very, very soupy. There's a lot of liquid there. There'd be no question. If it's more sort of a solid mass, so that there may be room to discuss. But generally speaking, we would assume it would be liquid. Okay. Condition number 2 is grufa uktuma. So this again, remember, we have two concerns. We have the concern of michzikim vashel, that it looks like cooking, which we'll get to. But before that, we have the concern that you may come to stoke the coals. So in the same way that we learned last week and the week before, that Chazal said that if you want to leave food on the fire before Shabbat, and you want to alleviate the concern that you will stoke the coals on Shabbat, so cover up the fire or move the coals so that you cannot stoke the coals. That's what's called gufa ktuma. That is called a covered flame. We discussed the inyan of a blech, right? And so too here. This is one of the conditions that we need, that the fire would be covered, so I would not be able to come to stoke the coals or to raise the heat in that way. We discussed last week how we achieve that with the stove. So that would be condition number 2. Source number 5 is the Mishnah. The Mishnah we saw last week is a very complicated Mishnah. We won't go through the whole thing again, but it says here, kirash isikua. The kira was a type of stove that was used in the days of the Gemara. The gefet of eitzim lo yiten ad shiglof or ad sheyiten et ha'efer. Over here, notice it says lo yiten. So again, for now, we'll go according to Rashi's interpretation of the Mishnah, which means this is talking about, this part of the Mishnah is talking about leaving food on the fire from before Shabbat. Turn over the page. And then it says, Beit Shammai omrim notlin aval lo machzirin, uBeit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Beit Hillel say you can even put it back. In other words, you can put it back on Shabbat, put back food on the fire. But again, which fire are we talking about? This was the kirash isukah begefet uveitzim, which we explained means it's being fueled in such a way that there are no coals that meaning that the coals have been swept away, so that there is no concern that will come to stoke them. Okay, Beit Shammai says, now this is interesting. Look at Rashi number 6. Beit Shammai says lo machzilin b'Shabbat michzikim vasha. Beit Shammai says even that Beit Shammai is concerned that this looks like you're cooking. But Beit Hillel are not concerned about that. They say af machzilin ho'il ve'garuf. Since it's swept away, since the fire is covered, that does not mean that it looks like I'm cooking, and there's also no concern of stoking the coals. Okay, so again, so just to summarize up to this point, it's not to get bogged down with the details. Number 1, our food is fully cooked, and if it's liquid, it's still hot. Number 2, our fire is a covered flame. Again, we will talk about a hot plate. Most poskim assume is considered a covered flame, and therefore that would not be a concern. Number 3. Condition 3, you'll see it says here on page 170, it says on top. This is not going to be so relevant with our appliances, but in the days of the Gemara, you can see in the picture that you have the kira. There were 2 ways of cooking. You could put the pot inside the fire. If you imagine today, you still have kind of a big tabun, those kind of ovens, where you could put the pot inside amongst the coals, or it has these holes on top. You could put the pot on top, and the fire, the heat comes from the bottom. So the Gemara here discusses that there is a difference between placing the pot on top or placing the pot inside. Essentially, the conclusion that we come to is that if you're putting the food back, you can only put it on top, but you can't put it inside. And the reason for that, now this application may not be relevant, but the principle still applies, which is that if you're putting it inside, it looks like you're cooking. That's the way that you would do it. Now it's interesting. Our stoves, actually, Shevet HaLevi, if you see on page 172, source number 10, Rav Vosna says that our ovens actually have an advantage over the ovens in the days of the Talmud, as follows. Look at the second paragraph. He says, Mash'en ken shelanu, shem pshutot, ratzah lomar, lo milamala o lamata, v'alken lo metzaba koach esh b'makom echad, yoter b'makom acher. In other words, the ovens in the times of the Talmud, you could put the pot inside, or you could put the pot on top. And by putting the pot inside, you were choosing to put it in location A rather than location B, where it's going to be hot. Our ovens, it's true that you would put a pot inside. He says, but that's the only way you can. It's the only place you can put the pot. You can't put the pot on top. You only have the option to put it inside. So you're not choosing one over the other. So this condition, he says, therefore, would not apply to our ovens. Obviously, yeah, there is a caveat that ovens, as we saw last week, are very, very complicated. And most poskim are going to say that to put food back into an oven that is hot on Shabbat, even once we've gotten past the questions of the thermostats and the Shabbos mode and all of that, which we discussed, that is not going to be simple at all. And most poskim are going to say, generally, practically speaking, when it comes to chazara, putting food back inside an oven, generally speaking, we would avoid that. We'd be stringent, but in terms of this parameter, it's not it wouldn't be such an issue. Now, Okay, all that is more or less an introduction. The major discussion when it comes to returning food back onto the fire on Shabbat that I've taken off, you'll see at the top of page 173. Here it's listed as conditions 4 to 5. There's much debate about these. Number one is whether you are still holding the food, and number two, whether you intend to return it. Now, where does this begin? It begins with the fact that we have a discussion in the Gemara, and the Gemara mentions both of these conditions, but the Gemara has two versions. And what comes out is that according to one version in the Gemara, I need one of these conditions, and according to the second version in the Gemara, I need both of these conditions, right? So the nafka mina is this: if I take the pot off the fire with the intent that I'm going to serve the soup to my kids, whatever it is, and then when it's still hot, I intend to put it back on the fire. Okay, seemingly that's enough because I intend to return it. Or alternatively, I take the pot off and I'm still holding it the whole time. I haven't put it down, even though my intent was just to put it down and not to put it on the fire, but I'm still holding it. So all the time that I'm still holding it, I could still put it back. According to one version in the Gemara, as we'll see in a few moments, so long as I fulfilled one of those conditions, I can put the pot back. However, the other version of the Gemara says no. It says if I want to put the pot back, I need to ensure that I have not put it down on the floor. We'll see what a countertop is. Is the point that I haven't put it down on the floor, or is the point that I put it down? Right. So I haven't put it down on the floor, and I intended when I took it off, I intended to put it back. Do I need one condition, or do I need both conditions? What lies behind it? What is the logic behind these conditions? Again, so here we're dealing with a fire which is covered. So stoking the coals or raising the heat, that is not a concern, because we've alleviated that. Our concern is michzikim vashel. Does it look like I'm cooking? And essentially what we're saying is this: once you have cut off, once you have ended sort of the previous cooking, you've ended the status of the spot on the fire. Now when I'm putting it back, so long as I'm putting the pot back on the fire, that doesn't look like I'm cooking, because it was there and I'm putting it back to keep it warm. But if I say that is stopped and I've ended that, and now it's as if I'm not putting it back on the fire, but I am taking a pot and putting it on the fire in the first instance, right? Then, well, you take a pot and put it on the fire in order to cook it. So that looks like cooking. If I've created that netek, right, that disconnect from the fact that it was on the fire before to the fact that it's going back on now, or it's going on now, so that would be the problem. That would be where I'm not allowed to put it on. And again, these are the two conditions. If I had the intent, when I took it off, I had the intent not to put it back, or I didn't have the intent to put it back. So now if I decide, I'm actually going to put the pot on the fire, now I'm putting the pot on the fire, I'm not putting the pot back on the fire. If I take the pot off and I put it down, so I put it down, it's no longer on the fire, I've put it down, this is where I'm keeping it, on the counter, on the floor, on the bench, whatever. And now I'm putting it back. Okay, so the question is, to what extent do we consider that I've disconnected from that original placement on the fire? So that's the Gemara that we have over here. Source number 11.
This would include dry, completely cooked food.
Yeah.
It does include.
Exactly. Yeah.
So on Shabbos, you can't take a dry piece of chicken and put it on the blech in the afternoon.
So we're gonna get to that. That essentially, then we have a new question. Once I say that I've not fulfilled the conditions, so I'm not allowed to put it back, then it becomes a question of what we call hanacha lekatchila. Now there are going to be certain conditions where I can take a dry piece of food in place, but just to answer your question, we'll get to this. But essentially, if we're dealing with a blech, okay, so to take a food that has not been on, when Shabbos came in, that food was not on the blech, and now I want to put it directly on the blech without any sort of separation, that would not be allowed. That would be that would precisely be michzikim vashel.
Yeah, it seems to me that, thinking back to my own experiences, there are situations in which a person would not have the intention of putting back at all, but would have to anyway. A situation which you're serving up to nice hot schnitzels, and after you've taken the pot off the whatever the source of heat is, you discover that 3 of the children at the other end of the table have gone down, and you don't know where they've gone. So instead of giving them the food,
that never happens.
It back, you've got to say, am I going to put it back on again?
Okay. So we're going to see. So again, one thing I will say is that when we are using hot plates, right, the Shabbos hot plate, first of all, that is going to, there are a number of advantages for that. There are a number of leniencies that we will have with a hot plate in terms of putting food lekatchila rather than putting food back. So that is why that is halachically advantageous. But assuming that you don't have that, that's why it's always a good idea. We'll say that if I'm in a situation where I'm taking the food off the fire and I might have to put it back, I should have the intent that I might have to put it back, and then I can solve that problem. But let's work through it out loud. So let's see the Gemara, source number 11. On page 173, the Gemara presents it as follows. So we saw our Mishnah said, Beit Hillel omrim af machzirim, Amar Rav Sheshet ledvrei amem machzirin, afilu b'Shabbat, v'af Rabbi Yoshaya sava af machzirin afilu b'Shabbat. Okay, that just means we're dealing with on Shabbat, because it could be, the Gemara has a discussion, is this talking about on Shabbat or before Shabbat, relating to Shehiyah? Second paragraph, Amar Rabbi Zerika, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Tadai, lo shanu ela she'odan biyado. Okay, so this is the first opinion that says that which you can put the pot back on the fire, that's only if it's still in your hand. But if you've placed it down on the ground, it would be forbidden. Okay, so first point is, this is a machloket. We see there's a machloket here, whether if I've put the pot down on the ground, I can put it back or not. One opinion says no. One opinion says yes. And then the Gemara continues, says, yes, pligi bar Rav Dimi, v'Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, v'tavar mishmei de Rabbi Elazar ami. Chad amar odan biyado mutar, agabei karka asur, chad amar nichan agabei karka, nami mutar. Okay, so again, so that is adkan, it's a machloket. If I've already placed the pot on the ground, can I put it back? One opinion says yes, one opinion says no. Now turn over the page.
What's the definition of ground?
We'll get to that. Amar Chizkiah mishmei de Abaye. Had amart odan biyado mutar, lo amran ela shedato lachzir. Okay, he says that which you said, the opinion that says, well, according to everybody, we've said, if it's still in your hand, you can put it back. So now he limits that. He says that's only when it was in your hand and you had the intention that you were going to put it back. Aval ein dato lachzir, but if your intent was not to put it back, or you did not have the intent to put it back, so then asur, then it would be forbidden. Michlal da'al gabei karka, afal pi shedato lachzir, asur. And therefore, so to the converse, if you had put it down on the ground, even if your intention was to put it back, it would be forbidden. Okay, so according to that version, I need both conditions. It still has to be in my hand, and I have the intent to put it back on the fire. Now, says the Gemara, Ikadamri, we have a second version of this. Amar Chizkiah mishmei de Abaye, had yamad agabei karka asur, that which you said that you put it down on the ground, you cannot put it back. Lo amran ela she'en dato lachzir. No, that's only if you put it down and you didn't have intent to put it back. Aval dato lachzir mutar. But if you had the intent to put it back, even then it's okay. Miklal shebeodan biyado, afal pi she'en dato lachzir mutar. And therefore, even if it was still in your hand, but you did not have the intent to put it back, that is mutar. Okay, so that's exactly what we said. We have a machloket in the Gemara is, do I need both conditions or do I need one condition? Everybody agrees that if I have neither condition, I took it off the fire, I had no intent to put it back, I put it down on the ground, then I can't put it back. Okay, but do I have one or do I need one or two? So how do we paskin? So it won't surprise you to hear that the way we paskin is, okay, we're achieving something. We're getting somewhere in this year. Very good. So says the Rosh, source number 12. He says, Amar Rav Zrika, Amar Rabbi Ami, Amar Rabbi Tidai, Lo shanu elo dam yedo, avani chan agabei karka. So Machiz ki mishmei de Abaye, Adam ado biyado mutar, lo amran en shtato lachzir, aval en dato lachzir. So okay, just really quoting the Gemara, and then he says, Vavtinan lechumra. So that is the opinion of the Rif and the Rosh, as well as that we require both conditions. That is the stringent view. Now, why? We can ask the question, why do we have to take the stringent view? I mentioned before, when we saw the Biur Halacha spoke about if there's a safek, if there's a doubt whether the food is fully cooked, he said you can't put it back. I said to you over there, it's a safek d'oraita. But over here, our safek is in a din d'Rabbanan. We're dealing with the case the food is fully cooked, the food is hot, etc. By placing the food back on the fire, I'm not transgressing bishul. I'm transgressing bishul, I don't even get to start the discussion.
That's like a bishul. I mean, that appears to be a. That's like a visual keeps override what the result is.
Mechzik and vishul is it in Rabbanan? Meaning there is no, so I have a safek as to whether only one condition or both conditions. I have a safek in the Rabbanan. The principle is safek Rabbanan lekulam. We rule leniently. So why are we ruling stringently? So says the Ran, he says, source number 13. He says, all of this is din Rabbanan. Okay? We'll leave that sentence for the moment because that sentence there is a little bit loaded, what the Ran is saying, and that is going to be a machloket rishonim, to what extent the food is cooked. But everybody agrees, according to the way they paskin, that we're dealing with a din Rabbanan. So he says, "Ichmiru zau bidvarim alalu, mibnei shem kruvin lavo lidei isur Torah." Okay, he says, Chachamim were stringent on these matters because it could very easily come to a Torah prohibition. Sometimes the principle is, at din Rabbanan, we say we have a doubt, we rule leniently. At din Doraita, we have a doubt, we rule stringently. But sometimes when Chachamim made Gzerot, they incorporated different things. He says, since it's very, very possible that one could come towards Torah prohibitions in these matters, therefore they were stringent. So therefore we need both conditions. Now the Rambam is lenient over here. He says, you see in source number 14, Rambam says, "Hu shelo iniach hakdera al gabei hakarka, aval mi shenicha al gabei hakarka ein machzirin ota." The point is that the Rambam only mentions one condition. He only mentions the condition of placing the pot down on the ground. He does not mention that I needed to have intent to put it back as well. So the question, though, that the Beit Yosef asks is, hang on, if the Rambam is saying we need one condition, we didn't find anywhere in the Gemara that it said you need specifically this condition of not putting it down. The Gemara said either you need one condition or you need both conditions. But if you need one, so even if you put it down, if you had the intent to put it back, it should be okay. Rambam doesn't say that. Rambam just says, make sure you don't put it down. So the Beit Yosef questions that it's not completely clear as to where the Rambam gets that from. But what we see from this is, bottom line, that according to everybody, I have this condition of that I need to make sure that I don't put the pot down on the ground. When I've taken it off, if I put the pot down on the ground, I cannot put it back on the fire. According to some, I'm required to have the intent to put it back as well. According to the Rambam, even if I didn't have that intent, it would still be okay. So long as I'm still holding the pot, I can put it back. Now, the question was asked before: what is considered the ground? What's considered putting it down? Have a look at source number 16. So this is the Gemara says by Rabbi Yirmiyah. So let's say you put it down not on the ground, but you put it down on the bed, or you put it down on a chair, or you put it down on the countertop. What is that? So the Gemara says take. We don't know. That is a safek. Okay, so we'll see in a moment what the contemporary poskim say. But Adkan, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, how they paskin on this. Again, to summarize what we have said. We have said that if I take food off the fire on Shabbat and I want to put it back on, there are a number of conditions that are required in order that I can put the food back on the fire. Obviously, it needs to be fully cooked, and if it's liquid, it still needs to be hot. We are only talking with a covered flame, what's called garuf katum. If it's an open, exposed flame, there's no blech, etc., then it's an ono. And the two real conditions which we need to discuss are, according to everybody, it needs to have been that I have not placed the pot down on the ground. And according to some, I also need to have had intent when I took it off that I was going to put it back on. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch number 17, he says, Kira shehi. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch in the original does not have the listing here of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's just here for easier readability. But he says like this: number 1, grufa uktuma. Okay, that's our covered flame, or the coals have been removed. Right, but atalak dera me'alea afilu b'Shabbat. Right, you took the pot off on Shabbat. Mutalach zira kol zman shiro tachat. You can put it back. It's grufa uktuma so long as it's still hot. Okay, that's dealing with liquids, as we've said, if it's solid, even if it's not hot, but it is fully cooked. Number 2, adds the Ramah. Notice that the Shulchan Aruch does not say this himself, but as the Ramah, he says, Voda biado, you're still holding it. Okay, and then the Shulchan Aruch says, Lo inicha gabei karka. So you didn't place it down on the ground. That's the Rambam, that everybody agrees on that. Number 3, this is an addition of the Ramah, because the Shulchan Aruch holds like the Rambam, so he does not require it. But the Ramah does require v'da'ato lachzira. You had intent to put it back. Okay? Now we're back in the Shulchan Aruch. Number 4, dafka al gabav v'tocho asur. Okay, we said that's not really so relevant nowadays. And number 5 as well, as we said, all of this applies only when the food is fully cooked. So let's see number 18, the Mishnah Berurah. He says, but this is the question. This is the machloket between the Rif and the Rosh on the one hand and the Rambam on the other, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. If it's in my hand, but I did not have the intent to put it back, when I took it off, I took off the schnitzel. I didn't know the kids were going to disappear in the other room, and then they were going to come back and want the food. Normally they don't. They only come back for dessert, but somehow something happened today that they came back for the schnitzel, right? And I'm still holding the schnitzels, so can I put them back? So הרבה מהראשונים מקילין, בעודן בידו אפילו אין דעתו להחזיר. Okay, the Rishonim obviously were familiar with this case of the kids running out, they're coming back for the schnitzels. So he says that the Rishonim are lenient on this. וכן מכירים בדעתו להחזיר, אף שבינתיים מסירו מידו. And also, okay, there are those who are lenient in the other way around, where we just have one condition, where I've put it down, but I had the intent to put it back. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, okay, so very important. When it comes to these halachot of bishul and food and sudot Shabbat, and lots of things can happen. It's important for us to know the case of lekatchila, b'di'eved, shatat chak, because there are many extenuating circumstances that come up at our Shabbos tables. So it says the Mishnah Berurah, it's not lekatchila, but he says under extenuating circumstances, if there is a need for it, so long as I fulfilled one of the conditions, I can rely on that to put the pot back on the fire. Okay. However, source number 19, the Biur Halacha, which as you all know is the same author. This is the Chafetz Chaim. He wrote the Mishnah Berurah, he wrote the Biur Halacha, and he wrote the Shara Tzion, 3 books that are all printed on the same page. Okay, he says, Da'ato l'achzira, lefi ze efshar, sheyesh lakel b'milta d'Rabbanan v'da'ato l'achzir, af shenicha gabei karka, o shoda biyado, v'lo yada'ato l'achzir, she'soko yachol l'achzir. Okay, that's essentially what we just said. So long as one of these 2 conditions has been fulfilled, there's room to rely on it. Now in bold, again, the bold is not in the original Biur Halacha either. That is an addition of the Tzurba. It says, Al kol panim, be'odan biyado ve'ein da'ato l'achzir, mistaber vadai sheyesh lakel et hatzorech. Right, so he says, if it's still in your hand, and you didn't have the intent to put it back, so he says that seems to be, as we've written in the Mishnah Berurah, that you can be lenient on that. And again, in that way, with that condition, we have more room to be lenient, because that's what the Rambam said. Now, וכן בניחה גבי ספסל וכדומה, וידעתו להחזיר, מאחר שגם דעת רב בית יוסף, כפוסקם מכירים בזה. If you've put it down, but you've not, but you didn't have the intent to put it back, also there, that is what the Beit Yosef said, we can be lenient. Now the Orchot Shabbat, and the way this normally works, that you have the Rishonim, and you have them, we get the Achronim, we get a little bit more Machmir. That's the way it goes. The Orchot Shabbat in source number 20, he says, Natal k'dera ma'esh grufa u'ktuma, adat lachzira, iminicha gabei karka, ein lachzira k'dera la'esh. Okay, so the Orchot Shabbat is a little bit more Machmir here. He says again, if you've taken the pot off and you've put the pot down on the floor, so even if you had the intent to put it back, he says, don't put it back. That is based on the fact the Rambam did not allow that. Okay. Now the big question is, which was asked before, is what if you put it down, but not on the floor? Generally speaking, I think it's probably more common nowadays that we don't put our pots down on the floor, but we put it. Remember, in the days of the Gemara, you think about what you have in the house, and you think about the kelim and the kitchens and and everything. There's the Gemara, you had a very, very small house. The word, many times in the Gemara, when you see the word bayit means a house. But very often, I think we discussed this in the context of Hilchot Pesach, bayit refers to a room. Because in the days of the Gemara, that's what you had. You had a room, and that was your house. You didn't have more than that. So you're going to take off the Gemara Pesachim talks about when you do B'tikat Chametz. Where do you have to search in your house for B'tikat Chametz? So it talks about the holes in the walls. Nowadays we have cupboards, but this was the way. This is where you would store things. They had holes, cracks in the walls, and that was where you put things. And then there goes discussions. What if mice got in there? What if there's a scorpion in there? What if you put your hole in the wall and it goes through, and your neighbor who's not Jewish on the other side, he sees your candle and he thinks you're doing witchcraft? All sorts of things. We can be very thankful that our houses today do not look like the houses that did in the days of the Gemara. But so you would take the pot off the fire, you put it on the floor. You didn't have anywhere else to put it. Imagine telling the Tanaim and the Amoraim that one day you're going to have a kitchen. You're not going to put your pot on the floor. You're going to have a countertop. Okay, we need to realize what luxury we live in. That we have countertops. Okay, whatever, Caesar stone, marble, whatever it is, how you cash. Okay, so the question is, When the Gemara says you put, but they didn't have countertops, but they had beds and they had chairs and they had benches. So the question is, when you take the pot off, you put it on the floor. That is our final resting place of the pot. Okay, but if we put it somewhere in an intermediary stage, is the point that I put my pot down on the floor, or is the point that I put my pot down somewhere other than the fire? So, Orchot Shabbat, source number 21. Again, this is a contemporary sefer. The Mechaber lives in Yerushalayim. He says, Natalk de'ram al gabei esh krufa k'tuma, u'b'dato lachzira, v'nicha al gabei kiseh. Okay, you had the intent to put it back. Remember, this is the Orchot Shabbat who told me that if I put it on the floor, even if I have the intent to put it back, I can't, right? But he says, you put it on a chair. So then he says, Yesh la'akar la'atir ta'chazara. Then you can put it back, so long as you had the intent to put it back on the fire. ודעת החזון איש, דאף אם נטל את הגדלה שלא על דעת להחזירה, והניחו על גבי כיסא, ואחר כך נמלח להחזירה, אפשר לעקר ולהחזיר. He says, the Chazon Ish said, even if you didn't have intent to put it back, but you put it down on a chair, okay, you've not put it down on the floor, and therefore you can put it back. ממזי, נטלת נערה מאש גופה כתומה וניחה על גבי השיש שבמטבח. Okay, so that was about a chair. Chair is clear that it's a that was the case that Gemara asked about, and that is clear that it's a sort of an intermediary stage. But if you put it on the countertop, so he says, so there are those. He says, you can see footnote number 15, quotes here of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Elyashiv, and Rav Karelitz, all reported to have ruled this way. However, it's then noted that this is in the footnote in the Orchot Shabbat he brings. It's noted that Rav Vosner ruled stringently about this case. So, many poskim say that putting it down on the countertop is not equivalent to putting it down on the ground. Yalkut Yosef says the same thing over here. Okay, so bottom line, where does that put us at this point? So what we've said is like this: when I take my pot off the fire, if I want to return it onto the fire. So again, so long as the food is fully cooked, and so long as the fire is covered, right? And now, if I haven't put it down anywhere, then for sure I can put it back. If it's been in my hand the entire time, I can put it back. There's no question. If I put it down on the floor, that's going to be a problem. If I put it down on the countertop, so what we're saying is like this: if I had the intent to put it back, then many poskim say, okay, that is enough, and you can still put it back on the fire. If I did not have the intent to put it back, okay, so then we're going to be a little bit more stringent, but there are those who say that even then you could put it back on the fire. Now,
does that mean liquid or solid if you put it on the countertop and you could put it back?
Again, the only difference between liquid and solid will be whether it's still hot. If it's liquid, so long as it's still hot, then I can put it back. With a solid, even if it's cooled down completely, but so long as it's fully cooked. Okay, now the Ran has an interesting shit over here. The Ran, one of the Rishonim, he is actually far more lenient than anything else. He writes the following, because he understands the Mishnah a little bit differently, that it's talking about Gemara. He understands the scenario in the Gemara somewhat differently, but he says the following, source number 23, the last paragraph, says, Lefize, Dafka benach lo mi ba'od yom, hu de machmilin. He says, all this discussion about putting it back, you thought that the discussion was that I have my food on a Shabbat, and on Shabbat I take my food off to serve it, I take off my chicken soup to feed it to the kids, and then I want to put it back on the fire. Says the Ran, that's not what we're talking about at all. He says, what the case is, where you took it off the fire before Shabbat. He said, before Shabbat came in, the machmirin, then we're going to be more machmir. Now you want to put it back on the fire on Shabbat. Okay, you started your meal with your kids before you lit the candles, you took it off, and now you want to put it back on. So that's all. Then you need all the conditions we've discussed. Says the Ran, this is incredibly far-reaching. This leniency. He says, if your food was on the fire when Shabbat came in, then there is no limitation as to whether I can put it back on. Again, assuming it's still hot, etc. But there is no limitation as to whether I can put it back on. So I took it off, I put it on the floor, I didn't have intent to put it back, doesn't matter. I can always put it back on the fire, so long as, again, it's not going to be an issue of Bishul Doraita. Now this Ran is very, very important, because we don't paskin this way, okay? But where we do paskin this way, you'll remember that we discussed the following. We have one of the future shiurim, we'll discuss Maaseh Shabbat. What is Maaseh Shabbat? Maaseh Shabbat is when somebody has performed a melacha on Shabbat, b'shogeg, b'mizid, however it is, whatever reason, Chazal instituted certain penalties. I said I cannot benefit from that. If a Jewish person cooks food for me if I'm a healthy person, and another Jew cooks food on Shabbat, which is a violation of an Issur, I'm not allowed to eat that food, and certainly not on Shabbat, maybe even Motzei Shabbat, and maybe never, depending on how it's done. But, one moment, if somebody did something which we hold to be forbidden, but there is a mainstream opinion in the poskim that says it's allowed to be done in the way that they did it. So, for example, we spoke about bishul achar bishul. We said if I have my cold soup, I can't return my cold soup to the fire because that is an issur of cooking. According to the Rambam, right, we don't say bishul achar bishul even by liquids. So according to the Rambam, I could heat up the soup on Shabbat. It's not a violation of bishul. And therefore, somebody else, if somebody relied on that opinion of the Rambam, somebody else could still benefit from it on Shabbat. So what we're saying here is this, that since the Ran says that so long as the food was on the fire on Shabbat, I can put it back on, that means if somebody did that because they were relying on that opinion, or they didn't know, but they accidentally, they put it back on, but I can still benefit from that, or I can still eat that food, even though we would say, you shouldn't put it back in such a case. Yeah.
One is for lunch, one Friday night.
Okay.
You have to put the one for lunch on the blech before you light candles in order to be able to return it to the blech, or can you leave it in the refrigerator? It's solid.
Okay. So the question was asked: if I have a kugel that I want to have for lunch, does that need to be on from before Shabbat, or am I allowed to on Shabbat morning put that food on the blech? Okay, so this is similar to the question that Paul asked earlier. That is a different case. That is not the case of chazara, okay, which is putting it back on the fire. That is the case of hanacha, of placing it in the first place, and that we're going to see that has got some of its own conditions. What I'll say is that we have to be very careful with our terminology. If we're dealing with a blech, or if we're dealing with a hot plate, it's a completely different scenario, completely different. But we'll get to that. Okay, so that is right. So let's just see just two more sources, just discussing this idea of the Ran, which we mentioned. Source number 24. You have here the Rama. He says, "Yesh omrim." All these conditions we've been talking about, right? That is only when, now he's quoting the opinion of the Ran, that's only when it was taken off the fire before Shabbat. So he says there are those who rely on this. He says, Tov lachmir, right? It's good to be stringent, not to rely on this Ran. He says, Miu im nitztanen l'kulei amasu. If we're dealing with liquid, okay, even the Ran would say if it's liquid and it became cold, then you can't put it back. The Shemarat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 25, he says like this: I have two pots on the fire. Right, so I have my two pots on the fire. One of them, which I've left on at the beginning of Shabbat, one of them is the chicken soup for Friday night, and one of them is the cholent for Shabbos morning. Okay, I accidentally took the wrong pot off. Right? So then he says, he says you can put it back on the covered flame. Again, so long as it hasn't cooled down, so long as it's fully cooked. That's exactly what we're talking about. That's b'di'evid. You could rely on that opinion of the Ran, meaning I took the pot off, I put it down, I had no intent to put it back on, because I thought I was just going to eat it now, and then I realized. He says, so we have this opinion of the Ran that says, since it was there, since I only took it off the fire on Shabbat, so I have room to rely on to put it back on Shabbat. So b'di'evid, or in the case of even more b'di'evid, we would rely on that. Okay, so that is essentially, those are the five conditions, however we want to classify them. That is those are the fundamentals of the sugya of Chazara. So next time, we'll look at our various appliances, our stove, our oven, our hot plate, our blech. How does this translate into practical terms. And again, I'm going to make that distinction, which I keep making, which is all of this, we're talking about the question of chazara, meaning the food was on the hot plate or was on the fire. I've taken it off. I want to put it back on. If I've lost all these conditions, meaning I've put it down, I didn't have intent to put it back or anything else, or now want to, it's Shabbat morning, and I want to put on my schnitzels, my kugel, whatever, I want to put it on the fire to heat it up. Okay, it wasn't on the fire from before. That is not chazara, that's not putting it back, that's putting it on, right? Based on what we've learned so far, it would seem that I'm not allowed to do that. So we're going to have to discuss what is again, our concern would be, michzik mashal. Our concern is always that it looks like you're cooking. When I put food, if I'm saying that part that was already on the fire, I'm putting it back, there could be a concern that I'm cooking. So certainly, if it's food that wasn't on the fire, and I'm just in the morning, I'm taking the food out of the fridge, taking the pot out, and putting it on the heat source, there's got to be a concern there that it's looking like cooking. I'll just put your mind at ease to say there are ways, and there are very, very easy ways to get around this, and we do allow it. And we do, again, we don't. The conclusion of the shir is not that you have to have cold cuts and potatoes salad for Shabbos lunch. That is certainly not the conclusion. But that is so again, just to summarize, what we said is, at least in terms of Hanachah Lechatchila, we'll talk about next week. But in terms of Chazara, so long as my food is fully cooked, so long as my fire is covered, right? If I had intent, if I didn't put the pot down at all, I can put it back. Even if I put the pot down, but I had the intent to put it back on, I can put it back on. Even if I put it down and I didn't have the intent to put it back, we saw that so long as it was on the fire in the first place, according to the Ran, there is still what to rely on, certainly b'diavad, to put it back. Okay. We'll see next week that, again, we may not actually need all of these things, depending on the hot plate, etc. Whatever is allowed in terms of Nitina L'Katchila is certainly Bakal V'chomer going to be allowed for Chazara as well. But that's next week. We'll get into more of the applications. Yeah.
Does it make a difference whether it's directly on the hot plate or whether it's piled up on top of things that's happening?
Yes, definitely. And that's what we're going to discuss next week. Right? The question was whether, I'm not sure if you could hear on the Zoom, whether it makes a difference if see you next week.